Hi, today we're covering the disappearance of Barbara Annette McClure, and she was born on May 19, 1954, in Seattle, Washington, to one Ray and Frances Anderson. As it just so happens, she was the youngest of three children. Her two older siblings were Ken, her older brother, and an older sister who went by the name of Sharon. Now, what set Barbara apart was that she was rather outspoken and oftentimes would be noted as being rather bold, all the while having a great sense of humor, which often made either people laugh or rather aggravated at her. It is also important to note that she was fiercely independent and rather strong-willed. Now, Barbara's father, Ray, owned a custom home building business and was rather well known for building over 1,000 homes in the greater Seattle area. In 1959, he would take on his most ambitious project, the original Westgate Chapel in Edmonds. This led Ray to be noted as a highly committed individual, but the thing that he was truly the most committed to was his faith. And it is important to note that he was often featured in the Seattle Times for his work, and both these points have led to some of the theories surrounding this case. It is important to remember that the Anderson household was a rather strict one, in particular due to faith being the number one priority for the family. Barbara's parents were often cited to run a rather tight ship, enforcing their firm and strict religious beliefs on the family. However, as a teenager, Barbara began to rebel against these restrictions, much like teenagers are known to do. And while she often pretended to follow the rules at home and at church, most who knew her knew that she longed for freedom. Some of the restrictions that she loved to flaunt were wearing makeup along with using girly clothing, to the point that she would often sneak both of these things to school and change back and forth between her school clothing and her family clothing. Actually, one notable incident that would occur happened at a church party when someone called Ray in order to report Barbara's behavior. Enraged, Ray would show up to where she had been and physically dragged her out of the event. And this directly caused a significant shift in Barbara's life, as her parents were not pleased with her actions, leading them to become even more strict and heavy-handed. This became even worse when they found that she started smoking pot and showing a vested interest in dating, both things that the parents strictly believed were against God's plan for the family. As a teenager, Barbara would eventually meet a man by the name of Randy McClure at King's High School, a prestigious private Christian school, and it is rather important to note that Randy was a jock, and distinctly different from the boys that her family approved, which were only known through church. And it was rather well known that her family did not approve of Randy, but Barbara was determined to follow her own path. It is to the point that shortly after graduating in 1972, she and Randy would elope. At first, her parents warmed up to the idea, hoping that marriage would help Barbara settle down into their vision of what their daughter should be. Soon, Barbara and Randy would welcome their daughter, Jamie, who quickly became the center of Barbara's world. And for a while, this life seemed picturesque. However, eventually the marriage would hit rocky ground, and they divorced. The exact reasons for the split remain unclear. However, after the divorce, Barbara embraced her newfound independence, enjoying being single. Later, in September 1978, she and Jamie would move in with a friend named Brenda. Fortunately for the child, Barbara and Randy managed to co-parent amicably, which allowed Barbara to start a new job at the Olympic Hotel in Seattle. And while she enjoyed her freedom, it seemed she was unaware of the lurking danger that would soon disrupt her life. On the night of Thursday, November 2nd, 1978, Barbara, her friend Brenda, Scott, along with another couple who were friends of Scott, met at the Sirloin Inn in the Forest Park Shopping Center. The inn itself was on the top floor of the building, with the Fandango Bar, which at the time was hosting Disco Night, on the bottom. As it just so happens, Brenda had recently met Scott at the hotel where they both worked at, and gotten along swimmingly with him, to the point that they often would compete at disco dancing competitions. That night, Barbara and Scott had a disagreement during the competition. Upset, Barbara would grab her purse as she told her friends that she was leaving and would walk home by herself. This was in part due to the closeness of her home. Barbara's home was just about 5 miles away, on the 1500 block of Northeast 89th Street. About an hour later, Scott and his friends, who were heading in the direction of Barbara's home, despite it being the opposite way of their own home, spotted her walking on the 16,500 block of Bothaway Northwest, about half a mile from the disco. They offered her a ride to her home, however, Barbara declined, and seeing this, they decided just to drive away. But rather than go to their own home, they went to another bar closer to their house, about 10 miles from Fandango. But later, they would return to the disco. After this incident, Barbara never made it home, and seemingly vanished without a trace. The day after Barbara disappeared, her roommate and friend Brenda called the police in order to report that Barbara had not come home. Initially, the police treated her absence as a missing persons case, where the person would just leave rather than a crime. However, Barbara's friends knew she had no credit cards and only a singular dollar in her purse, which added to their concerns, which means she could have likely in no way ran away or hailed a cab. On November 8th, her driver's license would be found near the intersection of Interstate 5 and Interstate 405, which was a dead-end road at the time. According to reports, a construction worker discovered her license. Additionally, Barbara's friends informed the police and her family that she had mentioned being followed around town previously that week, noting that whoever was following her, she had no idea who they were. And while Barbara was considered the black sheep of her family, a veritable outcast after her divorce, it seemed that the family had indeed not kept up, or seemingly not kept up, any connection even with their granddaughter after the divorce, which in essence meant that Barbara herself was socially excluded from the family in almost every regard. Decades later, a revelation by one of Barbara's family members shed light into a pivotal detail. It seems that Ray and a group of family and church members had actually been the ones to discover Barbara's driver's license, as Ray had chosen to search the exact location where the license was found, a remote spot off of a dead-end road, and about 10 minutes from Fandango, where Barbara was last seen. This discovery would shape the narrative surrounding Barbara's disappearance for years to come. In the aftermath, most of Barbara's family and the local residents would speculate, in particular, about two possible scenarios. Either A, she had chosen to run away, or B, she had been abducted by someone, either a stranger or, in the speculation of some, by members of her own family, in particular, those who were more closely affiliated with the church group. These theories would persist for a rather long time, contributing to the mystery surrounding her fate. However, it must be noted that when she was being followed, while she didn't believe she had any certainty of who was following her, it was often suggested that her father, Ray, could have been behind whoever was following her, and she could just not identify the person her father had sent. This, in part, was due to, before marrying Randy, Barbara had been distancing herself from her religious upbringing, and her parents, particularly her father, Ray, had seemed rather cross at this, going so far as to either directly monitor her every move or have other people be vigilant around her, as their trust would continuously erode over time. After becoming single again and living independently for a few months, Barbara felt a rather similar feeling. In particular, she shared with her friends multiple instances of times where her father seemed to track her activities closely and constantly know where she was and what she was doing, regardless of if she had seen him or been in the same area as him. And often her father would comment on who she was with and where she went. This was all in a manner that clearly depicted Ray's disapproval of her life, as he expected Barbara to uphold both respectability and modesty in his own narrow definition, which heavily relied on his interpretation of religious dogma. This in particular clashed with her nightlife activities, which he openly deemed and proclaimed to be inappropriate and flagrant embarrassments of the family and their church. At one point, her brother Ken would remark, "She was leading a fast life according to my standards, going out with a lot of guys to a lot of parties." So if he believed this, her father would feel the same in greater degrees. This perception created rather large amounts of tension within the family, as Barbara chose to continuously diverge from the image Ray had meticulously cultivated for his family. And it was after Barbara disappeared that life for the Andersons continued somewhat normally. However, 2 weeks after her disappearance, Ray, her father, would go to Barbara's home in order to collect a few of her belongings and items for Jamie, as he would go on to leave the rest with the homeowner. And it was noted that Barbara's brother would also sell her car, particularly shortly after her disappearance. Barbara's uncle, Roger Anderson, would go on to urge Ray to distribute flyers and offer a reward for any information leading to Barbara's whereabouts. To this, initially, despite being rather wealthy, Ray would only offer $6,000. Later, after social pressures, he increased it to $10,000. But despite these efforts, Barbara remained missing. 2 years after Barbara vanished, Ray would go on to receive a rather surprising call from Jimmy Hansen, a longtime family friend who would go on to claim to have seen Barbara on a beach in Hawaii while vacationing with his family. According to Jim, he tried to approach Barbara, but she ran away before he could reach her. However, Ray was rather skeptical of Jimmy's story and dismissed it as a whole, labeling him as delusional, going so far as to state Jimmy is crazy. It must be noted that Hawaii held a special significance for Barbara, who had visited the island before with her family, as Ray once owned a condominium there. This would have added a layer of familiarity, which would explain why she could potentially be there. However, it could just be a case of a mistaken identity, where Ray just scared a woman off because he approached her and he was a stranger. However, some of Barbara's friends saw this as a glimmer of hope for her safe return. After her disappearance, Barbara's daughter Jamie would go on to be raised primarily by her father. However, due to her disappearance, her grandparents would now play a much more significant role in her life. Despite their presence, they would rarely speak about her mother, Barbara, leaving Jamie with a series of unanswered questions about her missing mother. Eventually, Ray and Ken Anderson, Barbara's father and brother, would direct Jamie to Ken Gatos, a family friend and a pastor who claimed to actively be investigating Barbara's disappearance. However, no official investigators were aware of any such efforts from Gatos. Ken Gatos had apparently maintained a file on Barbara and would go on to regularly contact Jamie, reassuring her that he was actively pursuing leads on her mother's case. After Ray's death in 2006, Gatos would often visit Ray's widow, Frances, going on to provide her company. Eventually, Frances would pass away in 2016, followed by Gatos in 2018. And despite Gatos' involvement in Barbara's disappearance, the case remains unsolved and essentially still at square one, leaving Jamie and her family without closure. As of 2023, Barbara's case remains somewhat active. Before 2023, most of those who knew of the disappearance might have speculated that her friends, particularly Scott, were involved in the disappearance. However, as time has gone by and more information about Barbara's life emerged, the focus shifted significantly towards the very prominent and well-known challenges, along with the strange behavior that were brought to her due to her family and the church community that they were a part of, as her personal identity often clashed with her parents' expectations, creating rather notable ongoing tensions, along with some rather suspicious tendencies her father seemed to have. For Jamie, Barbara's daughter, one constant theme that she has had to deal with and noticed was the reluctance of others. In particular, the maternal side of her family seemed to not want to talk about her mother in any way, shape, or form. And when conversations did occur, they were often suspiciously vague and left the woman with a myriad of unanswered questions. Whether it was amongst her family, the church, or even Barbara's friends, details about her existence seemed to vanish following November 2nd, 1978. This has left many to raise the question: was Barbara abducted by a stranger in Seattle? Did she leave with someone who was familiar to her? Could her family or the church organization have been involved in the disappearance in any way, shape, or form? Also, many have considered the potential for the sightings of her in Hawaii to potentially not be as false as they originally seemed, and were the individuals who had previously kept tabs on Barbara, which were appointed by Ray, in any way involved in her vanishing. Unfortunately, these questions continue to haunt Barbara's family and friends, at least those who continue to seek answers, hoping to uncover some modicum of truth behind her mysterious disappearance. However, one avenue that seems to have some weight pointed in the direction of Barbara's family being involved comes from Barbara's niece and Ken's daughter, Carlene, who shared memories and insights about her aunt, often recalling how Barbara was generally excluded from all family gatherings, primarily because she was seen as an outcast. And due to this, the only times that Carlene would note that she would have proper contact with her aunt would be when she occasionally appeared around Christmas each and every year. However, when she went missing, Carlene's father, suspiciously enough to her, along with his wife, would ensure her that Barbara was missing, but that she would return home soon. And as the weeks passed without Barbara's return, Carlene's suspicion grew and became exacerbated by the church and her own family's rather elusive and unbelievably suspicious responses to her questioning. Despite her persistent inquiries about her aunt and how they knew that she would be coming back soon, it seemed people would only answer with vague platitudes and realistically with non-answers. Currently, Carlene remains notably estranged from her family due to the unresolved issues surrounding Barbara's disappearance. Despite the decades of speculation and occasional leads, the truth behind Barbara's vanishing eludes all investigators, as theories run abound, ranging from the possibility of foul play by some unknown party or those who were part of her own family. There is also the potential notion that she may have chosen to start anew under a different identity, all the while leaving her child, which seems unlikely, but it is a potential possibility. One compelling theory suggests that Barbara's strained relationship with her family and with the rather strict religious community that she had grown up with played a significant role in her disappearance. And there is always the hanging specter of that sighting in Hawaii, but ultimately, until concrete evidence surfaces, Barbara's fate will forever remain unknown, an unknown which, in essence, shattered her family. Unfortunately for the remaining family who still remembers Barbara and hopes for some modicum of closure, it seems this determination to uncover the truth behind her disappearance will likely not pay off in their lifetime. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.